Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a viscose, super lightweight, super drapey, nice and flowy, good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my front, my fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a little notch at the top and bottom of the fold line. So that's that done. So the first thing to do here is to join my front and back together at the side seams. So on to the back. Same thing again here, my fabric underneath is on the fold and I have those same notches at the top and bottom of the fold line. So just laying my back over my front, my fabric is right sides together and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So I've ran that edge through the overlocker and pressed that seam. And now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my armhole. And for this dress, I've decided on a bias finish. So just lining that bias up with the armhole, right sides together, popping in a pin, and taking to the machine now to stitch at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Taking this nice and gently, trying to match up those seam edges the whole way around. Starting and finishing with a back stitch. So I just need to trim down that edge. So I'm taking off here probably about 2/3 of that seam allowance. I'll finish that off camera. And now to press. So I'm pressing the bias away from the bodice, but making sure that that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the bias. And ready to understitch. So I'm placing my needle through the bias, through that trim seam allowance in underneath. I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the bodice fabric, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, starting and finishing with a back stitch. So now to finish the bias, I just need to take care of that raw edge. So just tucking that raw edge in underneath, pressing into place, folding again and pressing into place. And ready to stitch, this time along that inner crease edge, back stitching to start, using that same longer stitch length, trying to hug that inner crease edge the whole way around, and finishing with a back stitch. So that's at a press, and this is the result. Happy with that. And now that that's done, I'm ready for my shoulder flounce. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the top of the fold line, and I'm cutting this out twice. So the first thing to do here is to join these 2 flounces together at the side seam. So laying one over the other, my fabric is right sides together and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So I've ran that edge through the overlocker and pressed that seam, and while I was at the overlocker I've also ran my hem through it. And to finish the hem on this dress, I'm just going to fold it in underneath and press into place. I'll finish that off camera and ready to stitch. So I'm sewing directly through those overlock stitches, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, starting with a back stitch and finishing with a back stitch. So I've given that a good press, which you can see here. And now that that's done, this piece is ready to be added to my bodice. So just laying it over the top, wrong side of flounce to right side of bodice, lining up that center notch, lining up the edges of my bodice, and pinning into place. Exactly the same thing on the back. So the center notch, edges of my bodice, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, sewing here within my seam allowance, and back stitching to finish. And of course I do exactly the same thing on the back, and this is how it looks. Happy with that? So now this piece is ready for the straps. So I have 4 layers of fabric this time underneath my pattern piece. So that's those all cut out, and I have a little bit of prep work to do here before I can add these to the bodice. So just laying one side over the other, right sides together, and pinning into place. Stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start, little pivot there up to the point, and back stitching to finish. So I'll trim down those corners, turn the whole thing right side out and give it a press, and this is how it looks. And of course I've done that 3 more times. So that's my straps all prepped and ready to be added to my bodice. So lining up the edge of the strap with the edge of the bodice and pinning into place. Same thing for the other 3 straps. And now taking to the machine to tack into place. So stitching again within my seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. And of course I do exactly the same to the other 3 straps, which you can see here. Happy with that? So now that my flounce and straps are all tacked into place, I'm ready to finish the neckline. And just like the armholes before, I've chosen a bias finish. So laying my bias over the top, lining it up with that center back notch and popping in a pin, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start, coming the whole way around to my starting point, folding that raw edge back on itself, laying the end of the bias on top and stitching through all layers and finishing with a back stitch. And off camera I'll trim down that seam allowance, trim down the excess bias, press, all in exactly the same way as I did before, and here stitching through the bias, through that trim seam allowance in underneath, starting and finishing with a back stitch. And what this understitching will do is just help that bias to lie nice and flat, tucked away neatly in underneath. And again, off camera, I've taken care of the raw edge of the bias. So I've folded, pressed, folded again and pressed, and now ready to stitch that bias down. And the only difference here from the underarm is I'm going to leave myself a little gap to feed some elastic through. Starting with a back stitch, sewing right along that inner crease edge, coming around to my starting position again, and as I say, stopping about an inch or so away, back stitching, So that's my bias all attached around the neckline. Now for that elastic. So I'm using a darning needle here to help me feed this elastic through that channel. And I'll finish that off camera. So that's that done. And to close up the elastic, I just laid one end over the other, giving myself about an inch or so of an overlap, ready to take to the machine to run a zigzag stitch over the top. So going back and forth a couple of times just to make sure that's nice and secure. And now the very last thing I have to do to finish the neck is just to close up that little gap. So running a straight stitch here, right along the edge of that bias. So that's had a nice press, and this is how it looks. So that's my bodice complete. My flounce is attached, my straps, my neckline's finished with the bias and elastic, and now that that's done, I'm ready for my skirt. I have 2 layers of folded fabric underneath my pattern piece, a couple of notches to mark where my pocket will be, a notch at the fold line on the waist. So that's that done. So the first thing to do here is to add the pockets. So just like the straps before, I have 4 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, a couple of corresponding notches along that straight edge. So that's those all cut out. And here, just laying one of those pieces right sides together with my skirt, lining up my notches, lining up my edges, and pinning into place. Ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, sewing here at about half of my seam allowance, and finishing with a back stitch. So I just need to tidy up that edge just from the waist down to that bottom notch. So you can see I've went ahead and done that here. And now in preparation for understitching, I'm pressing that seam and pocket away from the skirt and ready to stitch. So just like before, stitching through the pocket, through the seam allowance in underneath, about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the skirt, using that same little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start, and back stitching to finish. So that's my pocket in place and understitched on one side of my front. It's had a good press, and as you can see here, I've done exactly the same thing on the other side of my front and on the back. So now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So just laying my back over my front, my fabric is right sides together, lining up my edges, lining up my pocket, pinning, and I'm firstly going to stitch from the waist down to that first pocket notch on the skirt, and once that's done, I'll then stitch around the pocket, over to the skirt, and down the side seam, lining up the edge of my foot with my seam, stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. So that's that little bit from the waist down to my pocket notch sewn. Happy with that. So I've just placed my pocket under my foot and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking this nice and gently, trying to maintain that beautiful curve of the pocket. By coming up to the edge of my skirt, sewing over the top, a little pivot, taking a couple of back stitches here, and then straight down my side seam, finishing at the hem with a back stitch. So I just need to finish my edges and give that a good press, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And now to finish the pockets, I just need to secure that top edge to the waist. So that's that all pinned into place and ready to stitch. So sewing within my seam allowance, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So I just need to give my pockets one final press, and this is how they look. So my top edge is all secured into my front. I've got that understitching helping the pockets to stay tucked away in underneath. Super happy with these. And now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my hem. So off camera, I've just ran the hem edge through the overlocker and pressed it up in exactly the same way as I did the flounce earlier. And here, stitching directly through those overlock stitches, using that same bit of a longer stitch length, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. And this is how it looks once it's had a press. And now that that's done, I'm ready to add my skirt to my bodice at the waist. So I've just popped my hands through the bodice and I'm going to pull the waist of the skirt through to match up with the waist of the bodice. My fabric is right sides together. Line up my notches. First of all, on the center front, pin into place the side seams, and lastly the center back, and ready to stitch. Backstitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and backstitching to finish. So that's my skirt and bodice joined at the waist, and I'm using this seam to create a channel for my elastic. So I ran the edge through the overlocker, pressed the seam towards the bodice, and now ready to stitch right along that seam edge. And just like the bias before, I'm going to leave a little gap to feed my elastic through. So starting with a back stitch, sewing, as I say, directly through those overlock stitches, the whole way around, and stopping about 1 inch or so away from my first stitch. So that's my edge all secure. I've got my little gap. Now for the elastic. So same as before, I'm using a darning needle here to help me feed this through the channel. So that's that done. And off camera, I've secured those two ends together with a zigzag stitch. And here, just closing up that gap with a straight stitch. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have my elastic at my waist, got that gorgeous flounce with the elastic over my shoulders, my shoulder ties, my armholes closed up nice and neatly with some bias, that beautiful full skirt with my pockets and my turned hems. And this is what it looks like on, and I could not be happier with how this has turned out. It is so versatile, so you can tuck the shoulder straps in underneath and have it as just a basic off the shoulder dress. You can pull the elastic up over the shoulders and wear it something like this, more of a sort of peasant style. I love everything about this. I love the length of the skirt, the fullness of the skirt. I love the pockets. It's so comfortable. Super light, super airy, gorgeous little summer dress. Love it.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!